Some floors are never meant to be walked on again, not because they rotted away, not because they collapsed with time, but because some eonia long ago chose to seal them shut. Carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of what they were doing. They covered those places with wood and plaster, then buried them beneath decades of silence, a broken bar helping that whatever lay underneath would remain forgotten forever. In the spring of 1887, a group of renovation workers arrived at an abandoned plantation house in Tensas Parish, Louisiana. Their job seemed simple: repair the aging structure and make the property presentable enough to sell. When they pried up the warped floorboards inside the house, they expected to find the usual things hidden beneath an old southern home, perhaps a crawl space, maybe a small root cellar, or possibly nothing at all. Instead, what they uncovered would begin a chain of events so disturbing that local newspapers refused to print the story. A county sheriff would spend the rest of his life trying to bury the truth, and a single surviving journal locked away in a family estate for nearly 40 years so would only offer a partial explanation. This is the story of Hargrove Hall, and of what lived a broken bar and died a broken bar beneath its floors. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Do you think the darkest secrets are often the ones hidden directly beneath our feet? Leave your answer in the comments, and tell us what city or state you're listening from. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time here, because this story only grows darker from here. To understand what happened at Hargrove Hall, you first need to understand Tensas Parish in the years after the Civil War. It was a region caught between two worlds. The Old South had collapsed, but the New South had not yet fully emerged. The land itself felt heavy and unfinished. Flat fields stretched endlessly beneath suffocating humidity. To the west, the Mississippi River rolled by, a thick, brown, and slow, and in every direction, bayous spread across the parish like veins of dark water, giving the entire landscape the feeling of something half submerged, a broken bar, as if the land itself might eventually sink back into mud and time. Before the war, cotton had made certain men extraordinarily wealthy in Tensas Parish. Men like the Hargrove family. They arrived in Louisiana in 1811 with little more than a land grant and an ambition that seemed almost typical of the 19th century American South: a restless, relentless, and often ruthless. By 1840, the Hargroves had built one of the largest cotton operations in the state. Their plantation stretched across 1,400 acres. Dozens of enslaved laborers worked the fields, and the main house, by rural Louisiana standards, so was undeniably grand. It was a two-story structure built of white-painted cypress wood, with a wide front gallery and deep shaded porches designed to catch whatever breeze might drift across the flat delta landscape. The man who built it was Harlan Hargrove. The historical accounts that remain describe him as a simple man in temperament, though not in ambition. He was practical, intensely driven, and largely unconcerned with how others viewed him unless their opinions affected his business. Harlan had a wife named Clara, a woman originally from Natchez. History preserves very little about her. Only a few letters survive, along with a daguerreotype taken around 1847. In the photograph, she does not look directly at the camera. Her expression sits somewhere between quiet resignation, a broken bar, and something harder to define. The couple had two sons. The elder was Harlan Jr., known within the family simply as June. The younger, Everett, died of fever before his 5th birthday. Like all plantations of its era, the Hargrove operation ran with mechanical precision. There were overseer ledgers and work schedules, records of punishments, a commissary where cloth and corn were distributed. Behind the main house stood the quarters, a long row of small wooden cabins where the enslaved workers lived. And beneath the main house itself lay a raised basement. At least, that was how Harlan Hargrove described it. According to the family, the basement was used for storage, cotton samples, tobacco, cured meats, or ordinary supplies a plantation owner might want close at hand. But what the Hargroves told the world about that basement, a broken bar, and what it actually contained, a broken bar, were two very different things. The workers who arrived in 1887 were about to discover just how different. Gerald Foss was a methodical man, 41 years old, born in New Orleans, trained as a carpenter before expanding into general contracting. He kept detailed work journals, a habit he developed early in his career and maintained throughout. And it is largely because of these journals that we know as much as we do about what happened at Harrow Hall in the spring of 1887. The journals are not literary documents. They're workmanlike, abbreviated, focused almost entirely on the practical details of construction and repair. But in the days following the discovery, Foss's entries change. The handwriting becomes less regular, the observations become more personal, and the questions he begins to ask, even in the private shorthand of a man writing only for himself, suggests someone struggling to organize a world that has suddenly stopped making sense. The first morning at Harrow Hall was unremarkable. Foss's crew assessed the interior damage, noted the worst sections of flooring, and began pulling up boards in the front parlor, which had suffered the greatest deterioration. The work was heavy and loud and smelled of mold and old wood and something faintly chemical that Foss noted in his journal without explanation, simply writing, "Strange smell when floor comes up, not rot, something else entirely." It was the second morning when one of his workers, a man named Teucer, who had worked for Foss for 6 years and whom Foss trusted completely, stopped what he was doing and called for the foreman. Teucer had been pulling up a section of flooring near the rear of the parlor, close to what would have been the original back wall, when he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. The floorboards in that section were newer than the surrounding floor. Not much newer, but enough that someone who knew wood the way Teucer knew wood could tell. A few years older than the rest of the first floor. Different pine cut at a slightly different angle, laid down not by the same hands that had built the original house. These boards been replaced, Teucer told Foss. After the house was built, maybe 10, 15 years after. Looking at the wood, could be more. Foss crouched and examined the section himself. Teucer was right. The wood had been replaced, deliberately, carefully, with the clear intention of making the replacement invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. "Keep going," Foss said. What they found once the replaced boards came up was a floor, another floor, solid, intact, running beneath the first floor of the parlor and extending, as they would discover over the following hours, beneath almost the entire first story of the house. It was not a basement, not a crawl space. It sat perhaps 14 in below the first floor, a fully planked surface, clearly intentional, clearly old. The original first floor of the house, Foss concluded, looking at the grain and age of the wood. The floor that Harlan Hargrove, Sr., had walked on when he first moved into this house sometime around 1838 or 1839, the floor above it, the floor that everyone had been walking on for 40 years, had been laid on top. The question was immediate and obvious. Why would anyone build a false floor over the original floor of their own house? And the question had a second darker part that followed from the first. What was between them? The space between the two floors was not empty. There was air stale close with that faint chemical smell that Foss had noted the day before, stronger now. There were in various places objects, small things. A tin cup, a length of rope rotted nearly to dust, a wooden comb with several of its tines broken, a strip of rough cloth that had once been dark in color, but had faded to something closer to gray. And in the corner of the parlor's original floor, tucked close to the original wall, there was something that stopped every man in the room when Teucer held up his lamp to illuminate it. It was a small book, not much larger than a man's hand, bound in leather that had dried and cracked, but had somehow in the sealed air between the floors, not entirely disintegrated. The pages were yellow and brittle, but legible, written in a small, controlled hand that was not the hand of an educated man. The letters formed with the slow precision of someone who had learned to write with enormous efforts and without formal instruction. Foss reached in and took it carefully. He didn't open it immediately. He held it in both hands and looked at Teucer and said nothing. That evening, back at the boarding house in St. Joseph, where his crew was staying, Gerald Foss opened the book. What he read changed the nature of the entire project. It also, in ways he couldn't have predicted that first night, changed the remaining years of his life. The book had no title page, no name on the cover. The first entry was undated, though based on context and the events it described, Foss would later estimate it had been written sometime in the early 1850s. It began with the simple statement written in that same careful hand that Foss copied into his own work journal verbatim. "I am writing this because I do not know who will find it or when they will find it, but I need someone to know what has happened here. My name is Cato. I belong to Harlan Harrove and I have been in this house for 3 years without anyone knowing I am here." Voss set the book down. He picked up his pen and wrote in his own journal. Discovered original journal. Can't determine if authentic. Can't imagine who would fabricate such a thing or why or how it ended up between the floors. Bringing everything to town tomorrow. Need to speak to someone about this. He did not sleep that night. The morning of the third day, Foss told his crew to continue the work, but not to remove anything else from between the floors without his direct supervision. He brought the small leather book and the other objects into St. Joseph and spent the better part of the morning trying to determine who the appropriate authority was to bring this to. The local sheriff, a man named Dupree, listened to Foss's account with the particular expression of a man trying to determine whether he was being told something serious or something that would in a few moments turn out to be a misunderstanding. When Foss was finished, Dupree asked one question. "How old are these things?" "Old?" Foss said 30 years, maybe more. Dupree was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do about it?" It was in its way a reasonable question. What Foss had found was old. The people involved, whoever they were, whatever had happened, were almost certainly dead. There was no immediate crime to investigate. There was no living victim to protect. There was only a small leather book and some objects and a mystery that had been sealed under a floor for decades. But Gerald Foss was not a man who could leave it alone. And as he read more of Cato's journal over the days that followed, slowly, carefully, going back repeatedly over passages he couldn't quite believe the first time, he began to understand that what he had stumbled into was not just old and not just strange. It was a story that, if a portion of it was true, implicated people who still had descendants living in Tensus Parish. And it raised questions about Harrove Hall and the Harrove family that would not, no matter how much anyone might want them to, simply go away. If this story is already pulling you in, take a moment right now to hit that like button. It helps us more than you know. And if you have a theory about what happened beneath that floor, leave it in the comments below, because we're just getting started. Cato's journal was not a continuous narrative. It was written in fragments, sometimes days or weeks apart, in an inconsistent order that suggested a man writing quickly and furtively whenever the opportunity presented itself. The entries were sometimes short, a single observation, a date, a name. Sometimes they ran for several pages in that precise, laborious hand, describing events in detail that only someone who had witnessed them directly could have provided. The picture that emerged from the journal over many readings was this. Cato had been enslaved on the Harrove plantation since the early 1840s. He was by the time he began writing the journal somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. He did not know his exact age. He had taught himself to read and write in secret using materials he had managed to acquire over years of careful accumulation. Scraps of paper, a stub of pencil, a fragment of a primer that had been discarded in the trash behind the main house. He was careful. He was patient. And he was in the years before he disappeared beneath the floor, one of the most trusted workers on the Harrove property, trusted enough to be assigned to the main house, to the domestic work that kept him closer to the family, and farther from the overseer's daily supervision. The journal opened in the summer of 1852, more than a year after an event that Cato referenced repeatedly but never described directly, only alluding to it in careful, oblique terms that Foss found maddening and illuminating in equal measure. Something had happened, something serious enough that Cato had decided at whatever cost that he needed to disappear. Not run, not escape north, disappear. And the place he chose to disappear was directly beneath the house of the man who claimed to own him. The logic of this, as Foss turned it over in his mind during those evenings in the boarding house, was almost impenetrable. Why stay? Why not try to reach the North or the Free States or even Mexico? Carter addressed this directly in one of the earlier entries in a passage that Foss would copy into his own journal nearly word for word. I know what you will think if you are reading this. You will think, why didn't you go? I thought about going. I thought about it for a long time. But there is something here that I cannot leave. Something that if I leave it, it will be lost. I am the only one who knows where it is. And if I go, no one will ever know the truth about what happened here in the spring of last year. So I stay and I wait and I write and I hope that someday someone reads this and understands. What was the something that Carter could not leave? The journal didn't say, not directly, not yet. What it did say in entry after entry, building a portrait of life in that sealed space beneath the floor, was how Carter had survived. There was a section of the original basement foundation that had been partially bricked up but not completely sealed, providing faint ventilation. Water came from a system pipe that ran close to the northeast corner of the house. Carter had over months of careful work before his disappearance created a connection to it that was invisible from above. Food was the hardest problem, and Carter addressed it obliquely, only saying that he had help from one who I will not name for their protection. A single person apparently, who knew he was there, and brought him provisions when possible. Always at night, always through a method so indirect and so carefully designed that even in the journal, even writing only for a future unknown reader, Carter refused to describe it clearly. He had been by the time the first entry was written, living in that space for over a year. He had in that time developed a detailed and intimate knowledge of the house above him. He could hear conversations, could track movement by the sound of footsteps, could tell with reasonable accuracy who was in which room at what time of day. He described the rhythm of the house with a precision that was both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The way Harland Sr.'s study smelled of tobacco in the late afternoon when he opened his window. The particular creak of the staircase that signaled the housekeeper's morning rounds. The sound of Clara Harrove's rocking chair on the second-floor gallery that always stopped at exactly the same mean time each night before she went to bed. He also described in entries that grew more tense and agitated as the journal progressed what had prompted the entire sequence of events. Not directly, not in the form of a complete account, but in pieces, small, sharp pieces that formed when arranged correctly, a picture that Foss found himself staring at in the lamplight of his boarding room, unable to put down. In the spring of 1851, Harlan Hargrove, Sr., had done something on his property that he had gone to considerable lengths to conceal, something that involved several of the enslaved workers on the plantation, something that Carter, in his capacity as a houseworker, had witnessed partially, and had been able to reconstruct more completely based on what he heard and what he learned in the weeks afterward. The journal named names. Not many. Carter was careful about that, understanding even then that the names he put on paper were themselves a form of risk, but there were names and dates and specific locations on the property. And these details, Foss realized as he read, were not the details of a man inventing a story. They were the details of a man who had been there, who had seen, who was documenting, with the meticulous care of someone who understood that documentation was the only form of power available to him, what had happened to people he knew. Gerald Foss spent the better part of a week reading and rereading Carter's journal before he made his next move. In that week, his crew continued the renovation work at Harrove Hall, and they continued to find things between the floors, not everywhere and not in large quantities, but scattered throughout the space in ways that suggested they had been placed there over time, deliberately with the particular intention. More cloth, more small personal objects. A pair of shoes worn nearly through that were too small to belong to a full-grown man. A child's wooden toy. A small horse crudely carved. One leg broken. A tin plate dented and scratched with a mark along the rim that Tuzan, when Foss showed it to him, said looked like a letter. It did look like a letter, Foss agreed. It looked like the letter N. scratched into the edge of the tin with a nail or something similar. He added it to the collection of objects he was assembling in a wooden box in his room at the boarding house. On a Thursday morning, 11 days after the initial discovery, Foss made a decision that would set everything in motion. He wrote a letter to a man named Aldrich Vane, who was at that time the editor of a small but respected newspaper in Natchez, Mississippi, just across the river from Tenses Parish. Foss and Vane had met years earlier through a mutual acquaintance and had corresponded occasionally since then, though not about anything of significance. Foss told Vane what he had found. He described the journal and its contents. He asked with considerable care whether Vane knew of any way to verify the historical record, specifically whether there was any documentation in the records of the Frury Edmunds Bureau or elsewhere that might corroborate the account Cato had set down. He also asked whether Vane knew anything about the Harrove family and whether any of them were still alive. The answer to the second question came back within a week, and it was the answer Foss had been both expecting and dreading. Yes, Harlan Harrove Jr. June was dead, but June had a nephew, a son of his cousin on the Price side, who had taken a strong interest in the Harrove family history. His name was Emmett Price. He was 34 years old, lived in New Orleans, and had visited Tenses Parish twice in the past 2 years, apparently researching the family's history with what Vane described in his letter as an enthusiasm that struck at least 2 people I spoke to as something beyond ordinary genealogical interest. Aldrich Vane was a careful man. He did not print anything about what Foss had told him, not yet. But he had been in the weeks since Foss's letter arrived quietly asking questions in the parish. And what he had found, he wrote to Foss, suggested that the people of Tenses Parish already had suspicions about Harrove Hall that they had never found reason to voice aloud. The house had a history that was felt rather than spoken. People who had lived in the area in the 1850s and 60s remembered things, half memories, overheard fragments. The particular silence that had settled over the Harrove property after the spring of 1851, the way workers had been shuffled and reassigned, the sudden absence of certain people who were never satisfactorily accounted for. None of this was evidence. None of it standing alone amounted to anything that could be pointed to and named. But it formed a context, a shadow, the kind of accumulation of small, unexplained things that in retrospect always surrounds the large and terrible thing that was being concealed. In the 4th week of the investigation, and by this point, Foss had stopped thinking of it as a renovation and started thinking of it as an investigation, however unofficial. He made a discovery that changed the nature of everything he thought he understood. He went back to Harrove Grove Hall alone on a Sunday when the crew was resting. He had been thinking about something Cato had written in one of the later entries in the journal, a passage that described with unusual precision a specific location under the house, not in the parlor, not near any of the areas where the objects had been found, but toward the back of the house, near the original kitchen access, in a section of the original floor that had, for some reason, been covered with a layer of lime, the kind of agricultural lime that was commonly used in the 19th century to treat soil and to suppress odors. He described, without dwelling on it, what had happened to her afterward. He described in a voice that was completely steady and gave Foss more unsettlement than tears would have. The years under the floor. I thought I would go mad, Cato said on the second afternoon. In the beginning, I thought the darkness would take me. But it didn't. I had the journal. I had the names. And I had the knowledge that as long as I was writing, the truth existed somewhere in the world. Even if no one ever read it. How did you get out? Foss asked. Cato smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 2 days. The war, he said. The war was many terrible things. But it was also a great confusion of ordinary arrangements. In 1863, there was a period of several weeks when the house was occupied by Union troops and June Hargrove had moved to relatives in Shreveport. The person who had been bringing me food for 12 years, I will not name her even now because she has family still living. She came to me and said, "The house is empty. It is time." He had been under that floor for nearly 12 years. He had emerged in the chaos of a wartime occupation into a world that was in the process of violently remaking itself. He had made his way to New Orleans. He had lived. He had survived the war, survived Reconstruction, survived the slow resolidification of the social order in ways he had watched and understood and carried with him for 20 years before Foss's article in the New York paper had reached him through a friend who knew a man who sent clippings. The Journal, Foss said. You left it deliberately. Yes. You knew someone would eventually find it. I knew the floor would eventually come up. Co said wood rot structures fail. Someone would come eventually. The question was only whether they would understand what they were looking at when they found it. And if they hadn't, Co considered this with the unhurried patience of a man who had had considerable practice with difficult hypotheticals. Then I would have kept waiting, he said. I have been very good at waiting, Mr. Foss. Gerald Foss left New Orleans on a Thursday morning. He spent the long ferry ride back across the river, writing everything he could remember of the two-day conversation, filling pages of his journal in the cramped, tilted handwriting of someone writing quickly against time. He arrived in St. Joseph that evening and immediately wrote a long letter to Aldrich Vane. He never saw Cato again. A letter he sent to the New Orleans address the following spring came back unopened with a notation in Claudette's hand that said only, "He is gone." Whether gone meant departed or dead, Foss never determined. Claudette did not respond to subsequent letters. The documents from the hatch along with Cato's journal and Foss's own extensive work journals were donated to a Washington, D.C. archive in 1891. They were catalogued under the subject heading Plantation Records Louisianatensis Parish 1840s-1860s. For several decades they sat largely undisturbed in that catalogue, consulted occasionally by researchers but never the subject of any significant scholarly attention. Harrove Hall was demolished in 1901 when the new owners decided that the cost of maintaining the structure was greater than its utility. The cypress wood was salvaged for lumber. The brick from the foundation and from the walls of the concealed hatch was used in a new outbuilding on the property. The original first floor, Cato's floor, the floor where the lime had been spread, the floor where 12 names had been written down in the dark, was burned. Emmett Price passed away in 1919 in New Orleans at the age of 66. In a Louisiana newspaper, his obituary described him as a dedicated scholar of Louisiana's past and a man deeply committed to preserving the heritage of the antebellum South. Yet within that tribute, there was no mention at all of Harrove Hall. Aldrich Vane stepped away from journalism in 1903 and died 4 years later in Natchez. Among his personal papers now preserved in a Mississippi archive there is a thin folder labeled simply Harrove. Inside are letters exchanged with Gerald Foss, notes taken during their investigation, and a single photograph. The photograph was taken in the autumn of 1888 by a traveling photographer working in New Orleans. It shows an elderly man sitting in a wooden chair outside an unidentified building. The image reveals little about the location. The man appears frail and thin but dressed with careful neatness. His hands rest quietly in his lap, and his gaze is turned away from the camera. On the back of the photograph, written in Vane's own handwriting, are just 2 words: he waited. Gerald Foss continued his work as a contractor around St. Joseph until he retired in 1907. In the final years of his life, people who worked alongside him noticed something unusual. At unexpected moments, Foss would pause and stare intently at a floor or any floor in any building with a kind of concentration that was difficult to explain. It wasn't exactly suspicion. It wasn't fear either. It was simply the look of a man who had learned something permanent and unshakable, that floors can hide things that buildings can be designed to conceal, and that sometimes the most important space in a structure lies in the narrow gap between one surface and another. Foss died in 1912. His work journals were later donated to a small local historical society, where they remained largely untouched for many years. In one of those journals are 12 names written by Cato in the darkness beneath the floor of Harrove Grove Hall, sometime around the winter of 1852. The names were Henry, Dora, Sam, Louisa, Remy, Pearl, Walter, June, Anne, Moses, Ada, Tom, and Bess. There were no surnames. In most cases, There were no ages. No surviving records exist outside of that journal. No graves have ever been identified. No official document created by any authority in the state of Louisiana acknowledges their lives or their deaths. All that remains is a journal, a broken bar, a hidden space beneath the floor, a broken bar, and the testimony of a man who could have escaped but chose instead to stay behind, record what he knew, and wait. The documents discovered in what became known as the Harrow Hatch have never been examined in any formal legal proceeding. The events said to have taken place in the spring of 1851 have never been officially recognized by any state or federal authority. Those 12 names have never appeared on a monument or memorial, but they exist in the historical record. They have been there since the night Gerald Foss first opened a small leather journal in a boarding house in St. Joseph, Louisiana, and read the words written in a steady and careful hand: "My name is Cato. I belong to Harlan Harrow. I have lived in this house for 3 years without anyone knowing that I am here." Those words entered the record then, and they remain there still. So what do you think really happened at Harrow Hall in the spring of 1851? And do you believe the full truth of this story was ever uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story haunted you as much as it haunted us, consider subscribing, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who enjoys dark mysteries and forgotten histories. We'll see you in the next story.